Welcome to the Charts podcast. In this episode, we are thrilled to have Kristian with us. He's the Secretary General at Electric. We'll tackle the subject of social license or social acceptance or acceptance communications for a new renewable infrastructure. Who is better to speak to this than Kristian? He brings more than 10 years of international experience with expertise in sustainability, climate and energy policy, EU policy processes, stakeholder engagement, change management, and advocacy. So, a well-versed man. Welcome, Kristian.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. So I'll just start with the questions, and we'll make this flow and have a conversation around this. But what is the power capacity gap that Europe needs to address with a new infrastructure to ensure a reliable and sustainable future?
Oh, it's a big gap, I can tell you. It depends a little bit about the time frame we're looking at, but I mean, just up until the end of this decade, we need to deploy some 600,000 megawatts of new capacity, and frankly, it's quite difficult to fathom just how much that is. But you can think of it along these lines. The system today roughly has 1,000 gigawatts. So in 6 years, we need to build 60% of everything that's been built and still stands on the ground in Europe. That's how much we need to, let's say, fill the gap. And then if we look beyond that, the figures become even more humbling, because actually we need to increase the pace as we move into the 2030s.
That's staggering, I have to say. But how is Electric working with the industry, EU policymakers, and communities to work around those challenges that you mentioned?
So in the last 5 years, we've really had a focus on saying, what does it actually take, and how do we need to do things completely differently if we want to land up in such a different place? Because it would be misguided to think that we can go about our business in the same way that we have for the last 10 years if we want to achieve something completely different in the next 10 years. So we've been working with policymakers in particular on topics such as permitting, such as grids, to show them just what that revolution in renewables will require, both when it comes to actually having the permission to put it up, but also to tackling the new flows in the grids that we will need to work with in order to make this happen.
Interesting. And an intriguing part of this whole thing is the communication part. We'll get to that later in the podcast. But so my next question, what are the key challenges that renewable project developers face in securing projects?
So maybe let's start with some good news here. What's really fascinating is just how immensely the price of the technologies have come down. If you look at a solar panel today, it really costs a fraction of what it did if we go 10 years back. And that has helped also, let's say, the speed and the acceleration of deployment quite significantly. But the challenges that developers face, I would say, relate in large part to three key elements, apart from the fact that the macroeconomic environment has also become a little bit more challenging in recent years with the cost of capital, the interest rates going up. But the three key challenges that developers are facing today, I would say, are, first of all, the permitting piece, which is to get the environmental and societal licenses that are required in order to put up a new wind or solar facility. Second, it is the grid connection. We are seeing staggering amounts of connection requests to the European grids. We are seeing, anywhere between a factor 3 and a factor 8 increase in the requests to the network operators to put new stuff online. And mind you, those companies, the grid companies, are regulated businesses, that means they're overseen by a monopoly regulator that basically decides 3 years or 5 years out how much they can spend. So even if the paper work grow by a factor 8, they don't have any room for maneuver to change the amount of employees they have, because that was agreed previously with the regulator. And the last major issue that developers face relates to the social license to operate. So the question of the citizens, the people around the facility, do they agree? Are they fine with this coming up, or are they making trouble for the developer? So I would say those are really the ones that we hear about time and again.
Very interesting. So permits, grid connections, and social license to operate. Very interesting. But moving on, what are the barriers that exist around infrastructure, making it difficult to talk about it in an accessible and appealing way? I mean, then I'm not talking to those maybe standing closest to it, but also outside of it, the public.
Well, I think one of the fundamental things about this communication situation is that the beneficiaries of a green project are not necessarily the ones that live next to it. Now, if your local city discusses to put up a sports facility, immediately you think, well, I'm going to go there every Sunday and see the games, and I might even have a chance to practice my badminton, whatever it is. That's not the case with the solar plant in the same way, or even more so with some sort of transmission line. The beneficiaries will be somewhere far away, and on top of that, the benefits of society is one that is a bit more abstract than most people can immediately relate to. We all want the green transition, we all want the green energy, but there is a very immediate tendency for people to say, but does it really have to stand next to my house? And I do not find those panels very beautiful, so couldn't we just put it somewhere else? And I think that's that fundamental of the communication situation, the sort of the question of who benefits, and the question of whether this is a tangible benefit for me or something more remote and abstract. These are the challenges in the communication situation with citizens and local stakeholders.
What an interesting and fascinating project. Thanks for sharing. On to our next question. So what does acceptance communication mean to you, and how does it relate to energy infrastructure?
So for me, acceptance communication means the process and strategies around creating acceptance for energy infrastructures, whether they are grid lines, renewable projects, storage batteries, or other equipment that is needed to make the electricity system function. And I think this is a type of communication where you cannot just, let's say, limit it to something which is about words or messages. It needs to have a very clear structure around it. It needs to be a systematized type of dialogue, and there needs to be a real element of objective, tangible, real life benefits that you offer as part of this conversation, real influence and real benefits to the local communities that you communicate with. This cannot be reduced to some sort of one-way communication or a marketing campaign. That will not create the result that we're looking for, which is a genuine type of acceptance.
Interesting. But as a follow-up to this question, what types of engagement practices are the most effective at empowering communities to buy into or take ownership of the concept of infrastructure project?
The ones that I have noted as being particularly interesting are the ones that basically result in communities accepting or even embracing big infrastructures that you would not normally have expected them to appreciate. And um, one of the things to consider is the process element that I mentioned. And here there's a couple of things to note. First of all, it's very important that you bring in the local community early in this process so that they don't feel that they're an add-on and that you're just doing this as a legitimizing exercise. You want to give them a real shot at influence in the process, but at the same time, you don't necessarily get a better result by dragging this out forever and having a very, very long process. So it needs to be a targeted process with a clear end station where you bring in the local community early and you offer tangible, real benefits. And then over to the benefits. Now, how do you provide real benefits? First of all, I think it's important to underline that when you're talking about multi-million or sometimes multi-billion euro infrastructures, you cannot be too stingy. You are leaving a 50-year-long mark on the landscapes where people have their daily lives, and they might even have to put up with some sound or some visual disturbances of the one or the other kind. And therefore, I believe that the most successful projects are ones that offer an actual tangible monetary or financial benefit to the community. It can be in the form of money, but it could also be in the form of facilities that are developed as part of this. For instance, if you're building a big transmission infrastructure, then you would have to procure or lease big amounts of land where this infrastructure is situated. Why not think of recreative facilities nearby, for instance, sports fields, and why not pay for that as part of this project? And if you're operating in a area with pristine nature or unique cultural artifacts or buildings, consider whether it is easier to basically draw a different line than the one that would, let's say, objectively be the most efficient. I've heard of projects where you'd make a 10-kilometer detour for a grid just because that was the way that this could most likely be accepted. There might be a double-digit million addition on the bill, but rather than seeing this as an extra cost, this might actually be a saving because the trouble you'd have in the courts might cost you 100 million instead of 50 million. So by bringing this cost up front and saying, okay, let's do it this way, you're buying a lot of goodwill and potentially also regular savings downstream in the project. It's much more expensive for a project to have a delay of 10 years because people are not happy than actually paying what's due to society up front, at least in some cases.
This is so informative, Kristian. Thank you. We're almost to the end of the podcast. There are a couple of questions left. But so what can the industry do to bridge the political divide and unpolarize the infrastructure development? And this goes back to what you were saying. People don't really understand it and they're opposed to it. But what can the industry do?
I think industry can do a lot. We touched upon processes. We touched upon the real intangible benefits. And one more thing that industry can really do is to make sure that there is a genuine and holistic sense or vision for sustainability in the projects. One of the things that we've been working a lot with in Electric is that relation between electricity generation and the surrounding natures. We call that power plant. And we developed on that sort of basis a detailed deployment guide for developers across different types of technologies to say, what do you need to think about when you build hydro, build grids, build wind, build solar? Those are different considerations, and you need to address it differently. But if you take as your point of departure that I'm going to think from the beginning, not only about the electricity, but also about the nature piece, you're going to end up with a much more sustainable project, and one that can also benefit the citizens and the surrounding environment much more. So taking that kind of sustainable approach, both from a people perspective, but also from a planet perspective, is going to help you ultimately, in our view. Comes with an extra cost, but it's going to be long-term sustainable.
Mhm. My last question, hoping to tie this all together and taking into consideration what you've said, but maybe my question is hard to answer, but how do you talk about infrastructure in a way that makes it exciting and acceptable to a wide range of people? And is it possible?
I think it is possible, and the first thing we need to do in this context is to think about what audience we're talking to, because what excites the political audiences might not excite other audiences very much. So applying that basic rule of communications, which is to say, who is your target audience, and how do you tailor your communication towards them is one that's very important. I think the fundamental privilege that we work with when discussing electricity infrastructure is that we are talking about the one critical sector for the energy transition and for climate action. This is the single most important sector to work in and to expand if we want to tackle the climate challenge. And this is, of course, also where lots of our communication starts. What we then find on the ground is that that's not always enough, and this is where those other elements come in, which relate to the everyday life of citizens. Well, it may be that we're saving the planet, but I'm going to have to put up with this thing for the next 30 years, and what are you going to do about that? And this is where that much more tangible discussion needs to come in, a very inclusive and holistic approach to the actual concrete projects.
Extremely good. Maybe the last one is more for a comment, but this charts podcast is of course part of our charts event, which we've been running since 2016, and you've been a part of when we came to Iceland once. So, and there we focus on, about what the energy brands, not just branding, but the brands and all the components they make of a brand. So this, there's communications, reputation, branding. There's also IT, customer excellence, corporate culture, people, etc. But in terms of what we've been talking about now, what kind of discussions would like to see us having, inside the conference room at Charts?
Well, I think this discussion about social acceptance is one that's only going to grow, and I think it will be very interesting to hear best practices, concrete examples of how these discussions have been led, and what have been, in the views of the developers, the critical keys to success. I think we also shouldn't underestimate culture in this debate about social acceptance, because what might work in the Nordics, in Denmark or Iceland, might not work at all in Southern Europe. So what are the differences and what are the commonalities, and try to sort of zero in on a set of best practices that can be deployed by developers. I think that might be a very interesting discussion. And I'd say we'd be happy to contribute with some of the elements from our power plant project, which really have some quite stunning examples of how you could envision infrastructure projects that on the one hand go over and beyond on biodiversity, and at the same time essentially provides new types of benefits for the local communities, whether it's recreative areas or whether it's real sort of tangible financial benefits. So that's, I think, an interesting area to explore further.
Wonderful. Kristian, thanks so much for taking part. I know you're a very busy man, and taking time to talk to our audience is very much appreciated. Thanks a lot.